5 children standing in the snow, and not a single husband in sight. She traveled 1,000 miles across the country for a man who never wrote a single word of those letters. The woman who came west looking for a new life found something no one had promised her: 5 desperate children, a broken man, and a family held together by nothing but a lie and a 13-year-old girl who refused to give up. Would she walk away, or would she step into a life that was never meant to be hers? If you've ever chosen something real over something safe, this story is for you. Hit like, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's begin. The train was 40 minutes late, which meant Eliza Whitmore had been standing on the platform at Cedar Bend Station for 40 minutes with nothing but her 2 bags, a thin wool coat that had been adequate in Boston and was humiliatingly inadequate in Montana, and the letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. She unfolded it again, not because she needed to read it. She had the thing memorized, embarrassingly so, but because holding it gave her hands something to do while the wind tried to peel her face off. Miss Whitmore, I am not a man who writes letters easily, but I find I cannot stop writing to you. She had believed that. She had believed all of it. The platform was nearly empty. A station master leaned in the doorway of the depot office, watching her with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen too many mail-order brides arrive and too many leave, and had long since stopped assigning them much emotional weight. A porter moved crates. 2 cowboys in heavy coats crossed the far end of the platform without looking at her. No rancher, no Caleb Mitchell. Eliza tucked the letter back into her coat pocket and tried to be reasonable about this. Trains ran late. Roads were bad. A man with a working ranch and 5 children had any number of legitimate reasons for being delayed on Christmas Eve, and she was standing here catastrophizing because she was cold and exhausted and had been traveling for 4 days on trains that smelled like coal smoke and other people's food. She was fine. This was fine. She looked out past the end of the platform toward the mountains. They were enormous in a way that photographs had not prepared her for. Not tall in the way that buildings in Boston were tall, but vast, filling the whole western sky with something that was either majestic or terrifying depending on how warm you were. Right now, Eliza was leaning toward terrifying. She heard the sound before she saw them. A jingling of harness bells, the crunch of hooves on packed snow, and then around the corner of the depot came a sleigh pulled by 2 gray horses. Not a large sleigh, not the kind a wealthy rancher might send, but a working sleigh, battered and practical, with a canvas cover over most of the bed. Eliza straightened. She smoothed her coat. She was a seamstress from Boston who had answered a matrimonial advertisement because she was 26 years old, utterly alone, and exhausted by a life that had no one in it. And she was not going to meet her future husband for the first time looking like she'd been dragged backwards through a snowstorm, even if she had essentially been dragged backwards through a snowstorm. The sleigh stopped at the base of the platform steps. The horses breathed steam into the cold air. A child climbed down from the driver's bench. Not a man. Not Caleb Mitchell. A girl, 13, maybe 14, in a heavy coat that was a size too large for her, dark braids tucked under a wool hat, her face pink with cold and tight, with an expression that was doing a great deal of complicated work all at once. Eliza stared. The girl stared back. Then the canvas cover over the sleigh bed moved, and a head popped out. A boy, younger, maybe 9 or 10, with a gap in his front teeth and eyes that were too big for his face and currently fixed on Eliza with the focused intensity of a hunting dog. "Is that her?" he said, in a voice loud enough to carry to the station master. "Hush, Thomas," the girl said, without looking at him. Another head appeared beside Thomas's. Then another. By the time Eliza's brain had caught up to what was happening, there were 4 children hanging off the sides of the sleigh. Thomas, a girl who looked about 7 with her mother's same dark braids. A boy of perhaps 5 who was gripping the side rail with both hands and staring at Eliza with open-mouthed wonder, and an infant-shaped bundle tucked in the arms of a boy who couldn't have been more than 11 and was holding the baby with the specific rigid terror of someone who had been told very firmly not to drop it. 5 children. No Caleb Mitchell. The older girl, the one who had climbed down, the one doing the complicated expression, came up the platform steps with her hands shoved in her coat pockets and stopped 2 feet from Eliza with her chin lifted at an angle that might have been confidence or might have been bracing for impact. "You're Eliza Whitmore," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Eliza said. "I'm Clara Mitchell." A pause. "Caleb Mitchell is my father." Eliza waited for the rest of it. Clara Mitchell pulled her chin a little higher. "He's not coming," she said. "He doesn't know you're here. He doesn't know about any of this." The wind moved between them. From the sleigh, Thomas made a sound that might have been the beginning of a sentence, but Clara shot him a look that ended it before it started. Eliza looked at the girl. Then she looked at the letter in her pocket, which she could feel even through the wool. Then she looked back at the girl. "Tell me," she said very carefully, "exactly what you mean by that." Clara Mitchell had clearly prepared for this moment. That much was obvious. She'd rehearsed something. Eliza could see it in the way the girl's eyes went slightly unfocused for just a moment, accessing something memorized. But whatever she'd planned to say, the reality of standing in front of an actual adult woman who had traveled from Boston on the strength of letters that apparently no one had sent seemed to be making the rehearsed version feel insufficient. What came out instead was simple and tired and more honest than anything rehearsed could have been. "We wrote the letters," Clara said. "All of them. My father didn't write them. We did. Me and Thomas and Annie and Benny, and we took turns on the ones that were longer because my hand cramps up after a while." She swallowed. "We found a letter he'd started once, when he was first thinking about it, before he stopped. We used his handwriting to practice. We got pretty good at it." Eliza didn't say anything. "I know that was wrong," Clara said. "I knew it when we did it. She stopped. Started again. "We needed something to change. We needed someone. And he wasn't going to do it himself." The baby in the sleigh made a small noise. The boy holding it, Benny, apparently, adjusted his grip with the expression of a person performing surgery. "How old are you?" Eliza heard herself ask. 13, Clara said. 14 in March. "And you wrote—" Eliza counted the letters. 8 months of correspondence. All of it. "I wrote most of it. Thomas helped with the parts about the cattle because Thomas knows more about cattle than I do. And he drew the pictures of the ranch that we put in the 3rd letter, the ones Pa, the ones that made it look nicer than it is." Clara's jaw shifted. "I want to be straight with you about that. It's not as nice as the pictures." Eliza pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed through it. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had grown up in a Boston textile house where falling apart got you exactly nothing, and what you did instead was figure out what the thread count was and how to work with it. She had sewn wedding dresses for women who were marrying men she privately thought were mistakes. She had hemmed curtains for the house she'd lived in for 6 years without ever feeling like it was a home. She knew how to contain a reaction until she had enough information to decide what to do with it. But this required a moment. "Why?" she finally said. "Why me? Why a stranger?" Something moved in Clara's face. The prepared version of this answer had clearly also been rehearsed, and this one she actually managed to deliver, though her voice went a little unsteady at the edges. "Because someone who already knows us might feel sorry for us," she said. "And we didn't need anyone to feel sorry for us. We needed someone who would come because they wanted to, because they thought there might be something here worth coming for." A pause. "And because someone who doesn't know us yet can't already have decided who we are." Eliza looked at her for a long time. Thomas had stopped trying to speak. The girl called Annie was watching with enormous eyes. Benny was still holding the baby with both arms locked and rigid. "What's the baby's name?" Eliza asked. Clara blinked. That was clearly not the question she'd expected. "James," she said. "He's 14 months. He's not much of a talker yet. He looks heavy." "Benny dropped him once," Thomas announced. "Back in October. He was fine." "I didn't drop him," Benny said, with the heat of someone revisiting an old injustice. He rolled off a table. A low table. Clara turned on both of them, with a look of such concentrated older sibling authority that they both went quiet immediately, which Eliza noted with a certain involuntary respect. She looked out at the mountains again. The light was going. It went fast up here. She could already see that. 1 hour it was afternoon, and then, without any real transition, it was going to be night, and the temperature was going to drop, and she was going to be standing on a platform in Cedar Bend, Montana, with 2 bags and a letter written by a 13-year-old girl who had very good penmanship and absolutely catastrophic judgment. She looked at Clara Mitchell. Clara Mitchell looked back at her with an expression that had given up on everything except honesty. "You should probably just go back," Clara said quietly. "I know that. I knew that was what would probably happen. I had to try." Something about the way she said it, "I had to try." Not dramatic, not pleading, just flat and factual, like someone describing the weather, got under Eliza's skin in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Does your father know you're here?" she asked. "He thinks we're at the Hendersons' place for a Christmas social." Clara hesitated. "He'll be expecting us back by dark." "And when you come home with a strange woman, what exactly is your plan for explaining that?" Clara's mouth compressed. "I'm still working on that part." The road from Cedar Bend to the Mitchell Ranch took just over an hour by sleigh, and Eliza spent most of it wedged in the back between her bags and the children, with Thomas asking her questions about Boston, at a pace that suggested he'd been saving them up for months. Annie sitting pressed against her left side with a quiet deliberateness that said she'd decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it, and Benny handing her the baby James as soon as the sleigh started moving because, as he explained with frank practicality, his arms had gone to sleep. James looked at her with the dark, evaluating eyes of a small person who was still putting together his theory of the world. "He likes you," Thomas said. "He's 14 months old," Eliza said. "He doesn't know me. He doesn't usually let strangers hold him." Benny dropped him. "I didn't drop him." "On a table," Annie said helpfully. Eliza looked down at James, who was gripping her coat lapel with one fat fist and appearing unbothered by the cold, by the argument happening around him, by all of it. She'd never held a baby before. She hadn't been around children much. Her work was solitary. Her life in Boston had been solitary. The absence of people to be attached to was something she'd made a kind of peace with, though peace was perhaps too strong a word. She held him a little more carefully. Clara drove, her back very straight on the bench up front, not speaking. She hadn't said much since the station. Whatever she'd spent getting the words out on that platform had taken something from her, and now she was just driving, taking them home, letting whatever was going to happen come at its own pace. The land was extraordinary, even in the dark. Eliza could see why the photographs had been flattering. The scale of the thing didn't really diminish, even when it was covered in snow and the light was failing. The sky up here was different. In Boston, the sky was a strip of gray visible between buildings. Here, it was the whole ceiling of the world, and even in the dying light, it felt enormous and cold and indifferent in a way that was somehow, paradoxically, less lonely than a city where people pressed against each other all day and never once made eye contact. She was aware she was rationalizing. She was also aware that she was sitting in a sleigh with 5 children she'd met 40 minutes ago, holding a baby who smelled like flannel and wood smoke, heading toward a ranch where a man was going to open his door and find a stranger standing in the snow on Christmas Eve, and that every sensible thing she knew about herself said she should have stayed on that platform and asked the station master to help her find a return ticket. She knew that. She was still in the sleigh. "How long has your father been a widower?" she asked, not to anyone in particular. Thomas answered because Thomas always answered. 2 years and 4 months, he said. Mama died in August. "Thomas," Clara said from the front. She asked. She asked how long. She didn't ask for just the how long is enough, Thomas. Thomas subsided, but not before shooting Eliza a look that communicated, with some eloquence, that Clara was often like this, and that he had feelings about it. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, "about your mother." "She was sick for a while before," Annie said next to her. "So it wasn't a surprise, but it still—" She stopped, started again. "It still was." "Yes," Eliza said. "It usually is." They drove in silence for a bit. The horses knew the road and moved at an easy pace, the harness bells quiet now that they'd found a rhythm. "Miss Whitmore?" Benny said from across the sleigh. "Eliza," she said, "please. Did you know, when you got on the train, did you know it might be— that it might not be?" "Benny," Clara said. No, it's all right, Eliza said. She thought about the question. She thought about the letter in her pocket, and the 7 letters before it, and the way she'd read the first one 3 times before she let herself believe it was real, and the way she'd told herself all through the planning and the packing and the long train ride that she was being practical, she was making a reasonable decision. She was not a woman who did foolish things. I think I knew, she said finally. Not that it was children writing them, but something felt almost too. She stopped, tried again. The man who wrote those letters was the man I would have wanted to find at the station, and I think I knew, somewhere, that the world doesn't usually work like that. We tried to make him sound real, Thomas said, which was so unintentionally devastating that Annie reached over and hit him gently on the arm. What he means, Benny said, is we tried to write what we thought he'd actually say, if he was the way he used to be. Eliza looked at him. The way he used to be. Benny nodded, carefully. Before. 2 years and 4 months. James made a small sound and grabbed a fistful of her hair, which he then held with extraordinary conviction. He does that to everyone, Thomas said. I noticed, Eliza said. The ranch came into view around the last curve of the road, a cluster of buildings against the tree line, lit from inside by lamplight, smoke coming from 2 chimneys. It looked nothing like Annie's careful drawings in the 3rd letter, and it looked exactly like what it was. A working ranch that had been kept up by necessity and not much else, functional and weathered and real in a way that drawings couldn't really catch. Clara pulled the sleigh to a stop in front of the house. They all sat there for a moment. He's going to be angry, Benny said. He's not going to be angry, Clara said, in the tone of someone who believes the opposite. He's going to be angry at me specifically, Thomas said, with a certain gloomy confidence. He's always angry at me specifically. That's because you're always the one who breaks things. I break things because I have energy. It's healthy to have energy. What's your plan? Eliza asked Clara quietly before they could go further. When that door opens. Clara was quiet for a moment. The lamplight from the house fell on the side of her face. I'm going to tell him the truth, she said. All of it. I should have done that a long time ago, but I kept thinking, she exhaled, I kept thinking something would change if I just waited long enough, that he'd get better on his own. He's not going to get better on his own, Annie said with the simple certainty of a 7-year-old who has been paying close attention. No, Clara said. I know. She set the brake on the sleigh, climbed down. The others followed, Thomas first, then Benny, then Annie, then Eliza last, still holding James, whose grip on her hair had not loosened. They stood in front of the house in a loose cluster, snow around their boots, lamplight warm in the windows, smoke lifting from the chimney into the dark sky. The door opened before they had to knock. The man in the doorway was tall, taller than the letters had suggested, which was a strange thing to notice, but Eliza noticed it. He was lean in the way of people who work outdoors and don't eat enough, with dark hair and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in several days, and eyes that were doing a rapid, bewildered inventory of the situation in front of him. His gaze moved across his children, counted them, landed on Eliza. He went very still. What? He said. He stopped, started again. Clara. Pa, Clara said. Who is this? It was not a question. It was the verbal equivalent of a man who has realized the floor is not where he thought it was and is trying very hard to figure out how far the drop is. Her name is Eliza Whitmore, Clara said. She's from Boston. She came on the train. Caleb Mitchell looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back at him. She became aware that she was still holding his youngest child, who was still holding her hair, and that this was probably not the first impression she would have chosen if she'd had any choice in the impression she made. She came on the train, he repeated. Yes, sir, Thomas said, with the slightly manic helpfulness of a child who knows he's about to be in trouble and is hoping that enthusiasm will somehow help. From Boston. She's a seamstress. She's very good at it. Thomas, Clara said, I'm just saying she has useful skills. Caleb Mitchell put one hand against the doorframe. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and in that look was the entire history of a father and a daughter who had been trying very hard to hold the same broken thing together from opposite ends and neither of them quite managing it. "Come inside," he said finally, in a voice that had gone flat, in the way of someone suppressing a great deal. "All of you. It's cold." They filed past him into the house. Thomas first, ducking slightly as if avoiding a blow that might or might not be coming, then Benny, then Annie, then Clara, who stopped beside her father in the doorway and met his eyes for just a second. "I'm sorry, Pa," she said, "but I'm not sorry for trying." He didn't answer. She went inside. Eliza stopped at the door. Caleb Mitchell looked at her, really looked at her, not the bewildered inventory of a moment ago, but a steadier thing, the look of a person trying to understand what they're actually dealing with. "Miss?" he started. "Whitmore," she said. "Eliza." "Miss Whitmore." He reached out and she thought for a moment he was going to take her bag, but what he did instead was very carefully detach James's fingers from her hair, one at a time, with a practiced patience that spoke to long experience. James protested, reached back toward Eliza's coat with both hands, and made a sound of genuine outrage. "Come here," Caleb said, settling the baby against his shoulder. He looked at Eliza over the top of James's head. "I don't know what they told you," he said, "but I owe you an apology. Come inside out of the cold and let me make it properly." Eliza looked at the house over his shoulder, the lamplight, the sound of Thomas already talking to someone at high speed, the smell of wood smoke and something that might have been supper on the stove. She thought about this platform. She thought about the letter. She thought about Clara standing in the snow saying, "I had to try," in that flat, factual voice. She picked up her bag and went inside. The door closed behind her. Outside, the snow kept falling on Cedar Bend, on the mountains, on the road she'd come in on, covering the tracks of the sleigh, as if they had never been there at all. The inside of the Mitchell house was warmer than Eliza had expected, and messier, and more alive. She stood just inside the door while Caleb Mitchell set James down on a blanket near the hearth, and the other children dispersed around her with the practiced efficiency of people who knew exactly where everything was and how to avoid getting in each other's way. Thomas disappeared into what looked like a back hallway. Annie went directly to the stove and lifted a lid to peer at whatever was inside. Benny dropped onto the floor next to James and immediately began a one-sided conversation with the baby in a low, serious voice, as if catching him up on the events of the evening. Clara stayed near the door. Eliza took in the room without trying to appear to be taking it in. It was a practical house. Not poor, but not comfortable in the way the letters had implied, the way Annie's careful drawings had suggested. The furniture was solid and old and had been repaired in places, the repairs not hidden, but simply done. There were boots by the door in 5 different sizes, lined up with varying degrees of care. A coat rack held more coats than it had probably been designed for. The table in the center of the room had 8 chairs around it, which was 2 more than the family needed, and Eliza filed that away without letting herself think about what it meant. On the mantel above the fire there was a photograph in a plain frame. A woman, dark-haired, with Clara's jaw and Thomas's eyes, and an expression that managed to be both amused and patient at the same time. The expression of someone who had learned long ago that the world was going to be difficult and had decided to find that mostly funny. Caleb came back from settling James and caught Eliza looking at it. She moved her eyes away immediately, which was the wrong thing to do. It made it obvious she'd been looking. But he didn't say anything. He just went to the stove and said something quietly to Annie, who handed him a dish towel and then drifted off toward the back hallway to follow Thomas. "Sit down, please," Caleb said to Eliza without turning around. "I'll put coffee on." She sat. Clara hovered for a moment in the middle of the room, caught between her father and the hallway, and then pulled out the chair across from Eliza and sat in it with her hands flat on the table in front of her, like she was about to be interviewed. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the sound of the coffee pot being filled from the pump. "How long have you been traveling?" Caleb asked, still not turning around. 4 days, Eliza said. His shoulders did something she couldn't quite read from the back. "They sent you the train fare." "Yes. I'll repay it. Flat. Certain. All of it, whatever the cost. I'll need a few days to get to the bank in town, but I'll have it for you before you leave." "Pa?" Clara started. "Not yet," Caleb said. Clara closed her mouth. He turned around with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Eliza and one across from her, then pulled out the chair next to Clara and sat down. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at her. Up close, the exhaustion was more visible than it had been in the doorway. Not just tired, the kind of tired that had been going on for long enough that the person wearing it had forgotten what the alternative felt like. There were lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with squinting into the sun. His hands on the cup were steady, which Eliza noticed because she'd expected them not to be, and then felt obscurely guilty for expecting it. "Tell me what they told you," he said, "from the beginning. I want to know what you were led to believe." So Eliza told him. She was direct about it, not because she wanted to make it worse for Clara, who was sitting next to her father with her face set and her hands still flat on the table, but because she was tired and the directness felt like the only way to get through it without making it into something more than it was. She described the first letter, the ones that followed, the description of the ranch, the children, the situation, a widower with 5 children, looking for a capable woman willing to make a new life in Montana territory, not promising anything romantic, but not ruling it out. She described the way the letters had escalated, slowly, over 8 months, into something that felt like a real correspondence between 2 actual people. When she was done, Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The handwriting," he said. Did it look like a man's hand?" "It looked like someone trying to write like a man," Eliza said. "I thought it was just, some people write carefully. I thought you were careful." Clara flinched. Barely, but it was there. Caleb looked at his daughter. The look was not angry, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. It was the look of a man trying to find the edge of something and not quite reaching it. "How long did you plan this?" he asked her. Clara met his eyes. Whatever she was feeling, she wasn't going to hide behind the table. Eliza noted that too. "Since last spring," she said. "I found the letter you'd started, the one in the desk." Something moved across Caleb's face. "That letter was in a locked drawer. I know where you keep the key." He exhaled through his nose, set his coffee cup down. "You forged my name. You corresponded with a stranger for 8 months using my name. You sent money. Where did you get the money?" "I saved it. From the household account over time. A little at a time. I kept track of every cent." She reached into her coat pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. "There's the accounting." He looked at the paper without touching it. Then he looked at Eliza. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am genuinely sorry. What was done here was wrong, and it was done without my knowledge, and I take responsibility for—" He stopped, started again. "I should have been paying closer attention to what was happening in my own house. I wasn't. That's on me." He pushed the paper back toward Clara without unfolding it. "You'll be able to stay tonight. It's too late and too cold to go back to town. Tomorrow I'll drive you myself, and we'll sort out the arrangements for your return to Boston." Eliza looked at him. "That's very organized of you," she said. He blinked. Apparently that wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "I know what you're trying to do," she said. "You're trying to make this tidy. The problem is that it isn't. Miss Whitmore, a week ago I packed everything I owned into 2 bags and got on a train," she said. And she kept her voice even because the point was not to make him feel worse. The point was simply to be accurate. "I sublet my room. I ended my work with 3 clients. I came here because I believed there was something here worth coming for." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because I'll send you back tomorrow doesn't quite account for the fact that there isn't much to go back to." The fire crackled. James, on his blanket near the hearth, made a small sound and then subsided. Clara was looking at Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite decode. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated than that. Caleb Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "What is it you're asking for?" "I'm not asking for anything," Eliza said. "I'm just telling you that go back is a more complicated thing than it sounds, and if we're going to be honest with each other tonight, that seemed worth saying." He was quiet for a moment. "One night," he said finally. "Stay tonight. We'll talk about the rest in the morning." The room they gave her was small and cold, at the end of the upstairs hallway, and it smelled like cedar and something faintly floral that she couldn't identify. Annie appeared at the door 10 minutes after Eliza had been shown upstairs, carrying an extra quilt in both arms that was nearly as big as she was. It gets cold up here, Annie said. Clara said you might need this. Thank you, Eliza said. She took the quilt. Annie lingered in the doorway. Are you going to leave tomorrow? She asked. Eliza sat down on the edge of the bed. I don't know yet. Annie considered this. Thomas bet Benny a nickel you would. Benny bet you wouldn't. She paused. I didn't bet anything. I didn't think it was right to bet on it. That was very mature of you. I thought so. She leaned against the doorframe. Miss Whitmore? Liza. Eliza, when you read the letters, did you think our father sounded nice? Eliza looked at the quilt in her hands. I thought whoever wrote them was trying very hard, she said, and I thought that was worth something. Annie seemed to turn that over. He was nice before, she said. Before Mama. He used to... She stopped. He was different before. I believe you. He's not bad now, Annie said quickly, with the specificity of someone who needs that point to be clear. He forgot how to be in the same room with us, I think. Like, he's here, but he's not... She frowned. Can't explain it right. You explained it fine, Eliza said. Annie looked at her for another moment with those large, careful eyes. Then she said, Good night, Eliza, and pulled the door closed behind her. Eliza didn't sleep much. That wasn't unusual for her. She'd always been a light sleeper, prone to lying awake listening to things, which in Boston had meant street noise and neighbors and the specific creak of her building settling in the cold, and which here meant the wind in the pines and the sound of the house and the occasional movement somewhere down the hall that suggested she wasn't the only one awake. At some point past midnight, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, and then the sound of someone in the kitchen below, not moving around so much as just being there. The occasional scrape of a chair. Silence. The low sound of a man who has sat down in the dark because the dark is the only place he can be alone. She lay there listening to it for a while, and then stopped listening and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing. She was, by any reasonable accounting, in an impossible situation. She had come to a ranch in Montana on the basis of letters written by children. The man who was supposed to have written them was downstairs in the dark, and the impression he gave was of a person who was managing, just barely, the minimum requirements of being alive, and who had not asked for her help and did not want it. The sensible thing, the thing she'd told herself she was good at, the practical calculation, was to take him up on the offer of a return ticket and go. She knew that. She also knew that the girl who had stood on that platform in Cedar Bend and said I had to try in that flat, tired voice was asleep down the hall, and that she'd been running this household since she was 11 years old, and that nobody had thought to stop her. Morning came gray and cold, with about 4 more inches of snow on the ground, and no sign it was finished. Eliza came downstairs to find Clara already at the stove, and Thomas already at the table, and what appeared to be an argument already in progress about whether Thomas had or had not used the last of the good butter. I used butter, Thomas said. There was butter there, and I used it. That's what butter is for. That was the butter for the Christmas bread, Clara said, without turning around from the stove. I didn't know it was the Christmas butter. It was in the same place as the regular butter. It was in a different dish. All the dishes looked the same. Eliza went to the counter and picked up the coffee pot and poured herself a cup without asking, because asking seemed like it would interrupt something important. She leaned against the counter and drank it. Thomas noticed her first. Good morning, he said. You stayed. I stayed, she agreed. I told Benny. I heard. Clara turned from the stove. There were shadows under her eyes that said she hadn't slept much either. She looked at Eliza with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite making it. Pa's out in the barn, she said. He's been up since before light. He usually like that? He's always like that. She turned back to the stove. Breakfast is almost ready. I didn't know if you'd want to eat before he drives you to town or... Clara, Eliza said. Clara's back went still. I haven't decided anything yet, Eliza said. And I'm not going to decide anything on an empty stomach. So let's just have breakfast. A pause. Then from the stove, biscuits take another 10 minutes. Fine, Eliza said. I'll wait. What? Caleb came in from the barn when the biscuits were ready, stomping snow off his boots at the door, and stopped when he saw Eliza at the table. He'd clearly expected her to either still be in her room or already packed and ready to go, and finding her simply sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee seemed to require a recalibration he wasn't quite prepared for at 7 in the morning. He sat down. Clara put food on the table. The children appeared from various parts of the house with the instinctive timing of people who have learned that meals happen at a certain sound and smell threshold, and within 4 minutes all 6 of them were at the table, which left 2 chairs empty, which Eliza carefully did not look at. For a while nobody said anything except Thomas, who was constitutionally incapable of extended silence and filled the space with a detailed account of a rabbit he'd seen near the east fence line and his theory about where it was living. Nobody asked for this account. Nobody told him to stop. Caleb ate with the focused efficiency of someone refueling, not tasting. He didn't look at Eliza much, but she was aware of the effort it took him not to, which she found oddly informative. It was Benny who broke it. Pa, Benny said, in the careful voice of a child navigating something fragile. Are you going to take Miss Whitmore to town today? Caleb set down his fork. That's the plan. It's snowing pretty hard, Benny said. I'm aware. Road might be rough. Benny, Claire said. I'm just noting the weather conditions, Benny said, in a tone of perfect innocence that fooled exactly nobody. James, in his chair at the corner, chose this moment to put his entire biscuit in his mouth at once, which caused Eliza to reach over automatically and remove half of it before he choked on it, which she did without thinking, and which caused a small silence around the table as everyone registered what had just happened. James looked at her with deep betrayal. She put the half biscuit back on his tray in pieces. He considered this for a moment and then picked up a piece and ate it, mollified. Caleb was watching her. She didn't explain herself. There was nothing to explain. The road's passable, he said, picking his fork back up. We'll leave after. He was wrong about the road. Not entirely. It was technically passable, in the sense that the sleigh could move through the snow. But it was the kind of passable that required constant attention, the horses working harder than they should have needed to, the runners breaking through ice in places and sinking into soft spots in others. And by the time they were 20 minutes out from the ranch, Eliza could see from the set of Caleb's shoulders that the trip was going to take twice as long as planned, and neither of them had dressed for a 4-hour round trip in deteriorating weather. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't say anything about it. For a while they just drove through the snow, side by side on the bench, and the wind cut across the open ground between the tree lines and the mountains sat there being enormous. You grew up in Boston, he said eventually. Not quite a question. Born there, she said. I grew up in a few different places. I ended up back there. He waited, which she recognized as the technique of someone who has learned that waiting is often more effective than asking. Orphanage mostly, she said. Some boarding situations. I learned to sew because it was something I could do to earn money while I was still in school, and then I just kept doing it. She watched the road. I had a room. I had clients. I had a life that was very, she looked for the word, accountable. I knew exactly what it contained. Then why answer an advertisement from Montana? Because I knew exactly what it contained, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. I found the letter, she said. The one you started. Your real one. Clara mentioned it, and I've been... The way she described it, it sounded like you actually meant to do this. He didn't answer right away. His hands adjusted on the reins with the automatic adjustment of someone who has driven this road enough times to do it partly from muscle memory. I meant to, he said. I started it in February. I'd been thinking about it since the fall, after... He stopped. I had a reason that made sense at the time. I couldn't finish it. What stopped you? He looked at the road. Finishing it meant deciding something, he said. And I wasn't ready to decide anything. What were you deciding? He took a moment with that. Whether I was still a person who got to want things, he said. And then, As if the sentence had come out more honestly than he'd intended, he adjusted his grip on the reins and didn't add to it. Eliza let it sit. After a while, he said, "The children need a woman in the house. That's the practical truth. Clara is doing things no 13-year-old should have to do, and I know that, and I haven't found a way to—" He exhaled. "I thought about hiring someone, a housekeeper. But the money's not there, not right now. The ranch had a bad summer." "So it wasn't purely romantic in origin," Eliza said. "No." He looked at her sideways. "That honest enough for you?" "I prefer honest to comfortable," she said. "I mentioned that." "You did." He turned his eyes back to the road. "I wrote in the letter that the situation wasn't, that I wasn't promising romance, that I was looking for partnership more than—" He stopped. "I was going to be clear about it, what the situation actually was." Clara was clear about it in her version, Eliza said. Eventually. "What did she say?" Eliza thought about it. "She said she needed someone who would come because they wanted to, not because they felt sorry for you. And she said she wanted someone who hadn't already decided who you all were." He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Eliza thought the conversation was over and was doing the thing she did, which was cataloging it and filing it away. Then he said, "She's too smart for her own good, that girl." "She is," Eliza agreed. "She's also running herself into the ground trying to hold your family together, and she's going to burn through all of it before she's 15 if someone doesn't step in." It landed harder than she'd meant it to. She saw him absorb it, not defensively, which she'd half expected, but with the quiet, tired recognition of a man hearing something he already knows and has been unable to fix. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said, and she said it without cruelty, because it wasn't about cruelty. "I'm not trying to tell you something you're unaware of. I think sometimes it helps when someone else says it out loud." He nodded, once. A small nod, economical, the kind that acknowledges something without opening into it. They drove another mile in silence. The snow was easing up, slightly, and the mountains were visible again on the western horizon, bright with the snow on their peaks. "The road back is going to be worse by afternoon," Caleb said. Eliza looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the horses, at the road, at nothing in particular. "There's no train east until the 27th, he said. "Even if we got to town today, you'd have to stay in the hotel 2 nights. It's not a very good hotel." He paused. "The children will be unbearable tomorrow if you're not there. It's Christmas." Eliza looked at the road ahead of them. "You could stay through Christmas," he said, and his voice was flat, deliberate, the voice of a man being careful. "Just Christmas. See the situation clearly before you make any decisions." A pause. "That's a practical offer, not a—" "I'm not asking for anything other than—" "I understand what you're offering," she said. "I'm not the man in those letters," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whoever they made me sound like—" "I know you're not," she said. "Then you know you might stay and find there's nothing here worth—" "I know that too." She looked at him. "I'm aware of what I might find. I've been aware of it since Cedar Bend Station, and I got in the sleigh anyway." He finally looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself do since she'd walked through his door. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "All right," he said after a moment. He turned the horses around. The Christmas Eve. They spent at the ranch was not the Christmas Eliza had imagined from the letters. It wasn't warm and soft and decorated with the kind of careful sentiment that the written version of Caleb Mitchell had described. The house was cold in the corners. The garland on the mantel was lopsided because Thomas had done most of it and had a theory about symmetry that was not borne out in practice. The Christmas bread that Clara made to replace the one that Thomas had ruined with the regular butter came out dense on one side, and Clara stood at the table and looked at it with an expression of pure exhausted frustration before cutting it anyway and serving it without comment. But Annie sat next to Eliza at the table and showed her a drawing she'd done of the ranch from the hill above it, and it was genuinely remarkable. The proportion was right, the light was suggested with a few careful lines, the mountains behind were austere and correct. Eliza held it and looked at it and said, "You drew the ones in the letters," and Annie said, "The ranch looks better from the hill." And Eliza said, "This is very good, Annie. This is really very good." and something in Annie's face went quiet and soft in the way of someone who has been told a true thing. Thomas gave her an 11-minute account of the naming conventions he had developed for the cattle, which was detailed to a degree that suggested genuine intellectual investment. Benny showed her the book he was reading, and they argued about whether the ending was earned, which Benny seemed to find enormously pleasurable. James fell asleep in her lap at some point in the evening without anyone having arranged for it to happen, and she sat very still and let him, because moving seemed unkind. Caleb watched all of this from across the room. He was present, which was something. He sat in the same room and listened and occasionally responded when the children spoke to him. But he sat with the specific quality of someone watching their own life through glass, close enough to touch the surface, but not quite reaching through. At one point, he caught Eliza looking at him, and she didn't look away. And he didn't either, for just a moment, before turning back to the fire. Clara came and sat next to Eliza near the end of the evening, when the younger ones were drifting toward sleep. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not leaving." She looked at the fire. "I know he told you to. I know this isn't what you expected. I know it's not—" She stopped. "It's just not what I described, and I'm sorry for that." "The bread was dense," Eliza said. Clara blinked. "The garland is crooked," Eliza continued. "The house is cold in the corners, and your father barely speaks, and Thomas cannot stop talking about the cattle, and there are only enough biscuits if nobody takes two." She paused. But Annie drew those pictures, and she meant every line of them. And Benny held James for an hour on a sleigh in the cold without complaining once. "And you?" She looked at the girl beside her. "You stood on a train platform and told a stranger the exact truth about what you'd done, when you could have just driven her home and let the lie hold a little longer." Clara was quiet. "This is a real place," Eliza said, "with real things wrong with it. I don't know what I'm going to do about any of it, but I know the difference between real and pretend, and I'll take real." The fire settled. From somewhere down the hall, Benny said something to Thomas in a low voice, and Thomas laughed. Not loudly, just a real laugh, surprised out of him. James slept in her lap with the absolute conviction of someone who has decided, without explanation and without apology, exactly where he belongs. Caleb Mitchell, across the room, was still watching the fire, but he had moved, sometime in the last hour, from the chair by the window to the one closer to the hearth, closer to where all of them were sitting, and Eliza wasn't sure he even knew he'd done it. She thought maybe that was the thing about a man like that. The moving happened before the knowing. The heart made its adjustments before the mind could catch up and talk it out of them. She looked at the fire and let the evening be what it was. Imperfect and cold in the corners and more real than anything she'd had in years. Christmas morning came in slow and gray, the kind of light that didn't so much arrive as accumulate, pressing in through the frost-edged windows until the rooms were dim and pale, and the snow outside had the flat matte quality of something that had been falling all night and intended to keep going. Eliza was up before the children. She'd slept better than she expected. The extra quilt, the quiet, the absence of city noise, and woke at 5:30 with the specific alertness of someone whose body had decided that sleep was finished whether the mind agreed or not. She lay there for a few minutes listening to the house, and then got up and went downstairs because lying still had never been something she was particularly good at. The kitchen was cold in the way that kitchens get when a fire has been banked overnight and the house has had several hours to return to its natural temperature. She found the wood box, found the kindling, and had the stove going in about 10 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken, but shorter than she'd feared given that she'd never dealt with this particular stove before. It had a temperamental draft and the damper stuck, but she figured it out. She was at the counter measuring coffee when she heard the back door open and Caleb came in from the barn, stopping short when he saw her. "Morning," she said. He looked at the stove, which was already producing heat, and at the coffee pot, which was already on it. Something in his expression shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize. Not surprise exactly, more like a man continuously recalibrating to a situation that kept not being what he expected. "You didn't have to do that," he said, pulling off his coat. "I know," she said. He washed his hands at the pump and sat down at the table with the deliberate movement of someone whose body has already put in several hours of work. She set a cup in front of him without asking if he wanted one, because the question seemed unnecessary. "Cattle all right?" she asked. "One heifer's been off her feed," he said, watching her. "How long?" He looked up at her. "Few days." "Is she the kind of animal who goes off her feed when something's actually wrong?" Eliza said, "or the kind who does it to get attention?" A pause. "The second one," he said. "Then she's probably fine." The corner of his mouth moved. "Probably," he agreed. They sat in the quiet of the early kitchen, the stove ticking as it warmed and the coffee between them, and the snow coming down outside the window. It was the most ordinary moment Eliza had spent in years, and she was aware of that, and aware of what it meant that she noticed it. The children came down in stages over the following hour. James first, because Benny had apparently been designated his morning keeper, and Benny was constitutionally unable to sleep late, and then Thomas at a dead run who had to be told twice to slow down on the stairs, and Annie, who came down with her hair still loose and a quilt around her shoulders like a cape, blinking with the sweet bewilderment of someone who was not yet entirely present in the waking world. Clara came last. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, saw the fire going and the coffee made, and the younger ones already fed with the bread and preserves Eliza had found in the larder, and stood there for a moment with an expression that was not quite relief, but was something adjacent to it, like a person who had been holding a weight for a long time and had just become aware of the possibility of setting it down. She didn't say anything about it. She just came in and sat down. The Christmas morning gifts were modest. Caleb had clearly planned for this weeks ago, before any of the current situation existed, and the result was practical and personal in a way that said he knew his children even through the fog of the last 2 years. A new penknife for Thomas that made him go silent with genuine pleasure. A sketchbook for Annie, the good kind with thick paper. For Benny, a novel he'd apparently mentioned once in passing and assumed had gone unheard. For Clara, a pair of good gloves, lined, the kind she'd needed for 2 winters and had never said so. For James, a wooden horse on wheels that he immediately tried to eat. There was nothing for Eliza which was exactly right and which she appreciated without saying so. She was not part of the gift inventory. She was not supposed to be. But Thomas, with the creative logic of someone who felt gaps required filling, presented her with a slightly bent tin star he'd apparently made from an old coffee tin at some point during the previous afternoon without anyone noticing. "It's for the tree," he said, holding it out. "We didn't have anything for the top." She took it and looked at it. It was uneven, and one of the points was shorter than the others, and it had a small dent in the middle that Thomas had attempted to hammer out and made slightly worse. It was not a beautiful object. "Thank you," she said. "This is exactly what was needed." Thomas looked enormously satisfied with himself. Benny rolled his eyes with the weary expression of an older brother who has given up trying to understand why Thomas's nonsense keeps working. Caleb watched her put the star on the tree from across the room. He didn't say anything, but he watched. Though the days after Christmas moved differently than Eliza had expected. She had told herself she was staying to see the situation clearly, to make a practical assessment before deciding anything, and she did that. She was honest with herself about doing that, but the situation had a way of not holding still long enough to be assessed from a distance. She fell into the routine of the house the way water finds a level, not through any deliberate decision, but because there were things that needed doing, and she was there, and competent, and it seemed wasteful not to. She took over the morning cooking, not because Clara couldn't do it, but because Clara had enough to manage with the lessons and the younger children and the general administration of a household that had been running on one set of hands for too long. Eliza cooked, and Clara directed the children's morning studies, and between them the morning stopped being a sustained, controlled emergency. She spent an afternoon with Annie and her new sketchbook, not teaching exactly. Annie didn't need to be taught. She needed to be talked to by someone who understood what she was doing, and they sat at the kitchen table with the winter light coming in gray and cold through the window, and Annie showed her everything she'd drawn over the last year, the pages of the old sketchbook worn at the edges from handling. There were drawings of the ranch, of the cattle, of the mountains, of her siblings caught in unsuspecting moments. Thomas in mid-argument, Benny reading with his feet up, James asleep in improbable positions, and one drawing near the back of the book of a woman sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup. Eliza looked at it for a moment. When did you draw this? The first morning, Annie said. When you made the coffee. It was a good drawing. The posture was right. The specific posture of someone who is trying to look like they're not paying attention to anything when in fact they're paying attention to everything. You're very observant, Eliza said. People are interesting, Annie said simply, when they don't think anyone's watching them. Eliza spent a long afternoon with Benny going over mathematics, which he disliked with a focused and principled intensity. He wasn't bad at it. He was actually quite capable, but he decided somewhere along the way that being capable at a thing you disliked was almost worse than being bad at it, because then you couldn't even claim helplessness. I don't see why it matters, he said for the third time, staring at a page of figures. Because you're going to run this ranch someday, Eliza said, or manage something like it, and the people who can't do the numbers are the people who get taken advantage of by the people who can. Benny looked up at her. Is that what happened to you? She hadn't expected that. What? In Boston. With the sewing. Did people take advantage because you didn't? I know my number's fine, she said. What happened to me in Boston was different. She paused. Do the figures. He did the figures, but he gave her a look first that said he considered this a subject to be returned to. Thomas was the easiest and the most exhausting simultaneously. He learned things at a pace that suggested his brain was hungry in a way that the ranch couldn't fully feed. And the problem was that when he wasn't learning something, he filled the space with talking, and the talking had a way of expanding to fill whatever room he was in. Eliza discovered early that the solution was simply to give him more. Harder questions, more complex problems, things that took long enough to chew on that he had to slow down. When she explained the principles behind the mathematics of land surveying, using the ranch as a reference, he went quiet for nearly 20 minutes working through the implications, which was the longest silence she'd witnessed from him since her arrival. Caleb came in from the barn during that silence, took in the tableau. Eliza at the table with a hand-drawn map, Thomas beside her with his head bent and his mouth for once not moving, and stood in the doorway for a moment before going quietly to get coffee. She didn't look up, but she was aware of him looking. They were careful around each other, she and Caleb. That was the accurate word for it. Careful. Not cold, not distant, but careful. The way you'd move around a room where someone had spilled something and cleaned it up, but the floor was still not quite dry. He was better with the children when she was there. She noticed that without fully understanding why, whether her presence made him more conscious of what he was or wasn't doing, or whether something in the changed atmosphere of the house made it easier for him to inhabit it. He started coming in for supper earlier, started sitting at the table longer after the meal was done. One evening, she heard him reading aloud to James from the book Benny had been given for Christmas, and the sound of his voice in the next room, low and steady, doing the different character voices with the resigned but accurate commitment of a man who has read to children before and knows that they will notice if you don't try, was the kind of sound that settled into a room and made it feel different. Clara noticed all of it. Clara noticed everything. She had the quality of a person who had been the designated observer for so long that observation had become reflex, and what she observed she processed privately and efficiently and didn't discuss unless she had something specific to say about it. She said something specific about it on the 4th day after Christmas. Eliza was in the small room off the kitchen that functioned as a sewing room. She'd found it the second morning, filled with mending that had accumulated over apparently the better part of a year, and had begun working through it because she couldn't be in a house with unfinished mending and not address it, when Clara appeared in the doorway. He watches you, Clara said, without preamble. Eliza kept her eyes on the seam she was working. People watch each other, she said. That's how people work. Not like that, Clara said. She came in and sat down on the low stool near the window. He watches you the way he used to watch Mama when she didn't know he was looking, like he's... She stopped. Like he's trying to memorize something. Eliza set the mending down. Clara was looking at her hands. I'm not saying that to make you feel a particular way about it, she said, with the careful precision of a 13-year-old who has thought about how to say something for a while. I just thought you should know because I think he doesn't know he's doing it, and... She looked up. I didn't want you to miss it. Clara, Eliza said, I know it's complicated. I'm not asking you to. I hear you, Eliza said. Clara nodded, looked at the mending in Eliza's hands. He hasn't let anyone touch her sewing room, she said. In 2 years. I tried once just to organize it, and he asked me not to. Eliza looked around the room. The pile of mending she'd been working through was clearly household work. Shirts, trousers, a child's dress. But along the near wall, untouched and separate, was another basket. She'd noticed it on the first day and not opened it. He let you in here, Clara said. Eliza didn't respond to that. She picked the mending back up. Clara got up from the stool after a moment. At the door, she stopped. He's going to try to convince himself this is a bad idea, she said. He's going to come up with reasons. He's good at reasons. She paused. I just thought you should know that too. She left, and Eliza sat in the sewing room with the mending and the untouched basket against the wall, and the sound of the house around her, and didn't let herself think too hard about any of it. But it was Caleb who broke the careful distance between them. He didn't mean to. It was the 5th day, the 30th of December, and the weather had cleared enough for the children to go outside after lessons, and Eliza was at the kitchen window watching Thomas and Benny in the yard when she heard Caleb behind her. I owe you an explanation, he said. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was doing something he'd decided to do before he was quite ready for it. For what? She said. For the sewing room. He looked at the hat. Clara told me you'd been using it. I should have told you it was all right when you came in. I just didn't think to. I should have asked, she said. No, he said it firmly. It's a workroom. It should be used. He paused. Margaret would have hated it the way it's been. She didn't leave things unfinished. It was the first time he'd said her name directly. Eliza was careful not to react to it. She sounds like she was very competent, she said. She was. Something moved in his face. Not grief exactly, more like the specific expression of someone describing something that is both past and permanent. She was better at all of this than I am. Better with the children. Better at making the house feel like... He stopped. She had a way of making things feel intentional, like everything that happened was something she'd decided to allow. That's a quality, Eliza said. Yes. He looked at her. You have it too. She wasn't sure what to do with that. I'm not her, Eliza said. Not defensively, just as a fact. I know that, he said. I know that. He turned his hat once in his hands. What I'm trying to say is, badly, is that I've been watching you this week, and I've been trying very hard to have a reason why you being here is a problem, and I haven't been able to find one. He looked up. Which is its own kind of problem. Because you want there to be one, she said. Because I'm more comfortable with there being one. He held her gaze. I know how to manage grief. I've been doing it for 2 years. I don't know how to manage this. This, she said. You, he said plainly. Being here. He stopped, and something crossed his face that was half frustration with himself and half something more unguarded. Clara asked you to stay through Christmas, and Christmas was 3 days ago, and you're still here, and I haven't asked you to leave, and I think we should probably be honest with each other about what that means. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Thomas yelled something at Benny, and Benny yelled something back, and there was a thump that was probably someone going down in the snow. What do you think it means? She asked. He set his hat down on the table. I think it means I don't want you to leave, he said. And I think that is the most terrifying thing I've said out loud in 2 years. Eliza looked at him. He was standing there in his kitchen on the 30th of December, being honest with her in that particular way of people for whom honesty is not a natural comfort, but a deliberate act, and she was aware of exactly how much it had cost him to get to this sentence. I'm not going to rush anything, she said finally, and neither should you. We don't know each other. No, he agreed. The children knowing me is not the same as you knowing me. No. But, she said, and she paused, because the next thing she said she wanted to say accurately. I am not a person who came here by accident. I got on that train because something in those letters, even knowing what I know now about who wrote them, said there was something here worth the risk. And that wasn't wrong. She held his gaze. It wasn't what I expected, but it wasn't wrong. He was very still. Stay through the new year, he said. Just through the new year, and after that, he stopped. I'd like to have a real conversation. Without the crisis of your arrival in it, without Christmas in it, just what this is, or could be, or might not be. That's a reasonable thing to ask, she said. Something went out of his shoulders. Not all of it, not even most of it, but something. All right, she said. The last day of December was clear and cold, and the mountains were brilliant white under a sky that had gone the deep, saturated blue of winter at altitude, and Caleb came in at noon from the fence line and said without any preliminary that there was a hill about a mile from the house where the view of the valley was worth seeing if she wanted to walk out with him. She said yes before she'd made a decision to say it, which was information, as they went. The tree line where the deer bedded in heavy weather, the frozen creek that ran better in spring, the place on the east slope where the snow was thinner because the wind scoured it. She listened to all of it and understood that he was telling her something larger than the information itself. The hill was not dramatic, not what she'd have called a hill in a landscape this large. But when they crested it and she turned to look back, she saw the valley spread out below them, the ranch building small and dark against the white, the frozen glitter of the creek, the mountains ringing it all on three sides. She stood there and looked at it. Annie got it right, she said. The proportion. He looked at the valley. She drew it from up here, he said. She used to come up with Margaret. He paused. She came up alone after. I didn't know she was still doing it until I came looking for her one afternoon. She was doing what made sense, Eliza said. That's what children do. They do, he said. They do a better job of it than I've been doing. She didn't dispute it. They stood there in the cold and looked at the valley, and the silence between them was not the careful silence of the kitchen, but something easier, something that had more room in it. I was not a good husband the last year she was sick, he said abruptly. I want you to know that. Whatever image the letters gave you, whatever story the children told, I was not easy to be married to when things were hard. I worked too much. I made it about the ranch when it should have been about her. He was looking at the mountains, not at her. I've been trying to figure out for 2 years whether the grief is grief or whether it's guilt, and I can't always tell the difference. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Maybe it's both, she said. Probably. He exhaled. I'm telling you this because I meant what I said yesterday, about a real conversation. And a real conversation probably starts with the parts you'd rather not say. She turned to look at him. His profile was sharp in the cold light, the jaw she'd been looking at for a week, the eyes that were fixed somewhere in the middle distance. I left people, she said, in Boston. Not dramatically, just I moved on, or they did, and I didn't fight to keep anything, because it was always easier to let things end than to hold on to something that might not hold you back. She paused. I told myself that was being realistic. I think mostly it was being afraid. He looked at her then. I'm telling you that, she said, because I think you should know that whatever you're afraid of, I am not without my own. I'm not someone who arrived here already figured out. The wind moved across the hill. Below them, a thin line of smoke rose from the ranch house chimney into the cold blue sky. Thomas is going to burn something, Caleb said. He absolutely is, Eliza agreed. They stood there for another moment, and then he put his hand out, not reaching for her hand, but just out, open, in the space between them, an offer that could be declined without acknowledgement. She put her hand in his. They stood like that for a while on the hill, looking at the valley, the ranch below them small and real against the white, and did not say anything else because nothing else was required. The new year came in quietly, as it does in working households where the animals don't stop needing tending because the calendar has changed. Caleb brought in the new year with an extra log on the fire and a glass of something amber that he poured 2 portions of without asking and set one in front of Eliza at the kitchen table, and the children were in bed, and it was the first time they'd been alone in a room together without the immediate presence or imminent arrival of at least one small person. They talked for 2 hours. Real talking, the kind Clara had asked for on that hill, the kind that doesn't perform itself for an audience. He told her about the ranch, about how it had been when he'd first built it and how it had changed, about Margaret, about the year she got sick and how he'd handled it badly. She told him about the orphanage and the boarding situations and the 6 years in the same room in Boston that she'd never managed to make feel like home. They were not confessing to each other. It was nothing so dramatic as that. They were simply being accurate about what they were, the way people have to be when they're trying to figure out if they can trust each other with anything larger. At some point, she noticed that the lamp between them was burning low, and neither of them had moved to turn it up, and the fire had gone down to coals, and the room was lit mostly by that red-orange glow. "It's late," he said. "It is," she agreed. He reached over and turned the lamp up. The light changed, went warmer, steadier. "I'm not going to pretend," he said, "that I know what this becomes. I don't. I think it would be dishonest to promise something I'm not sure I'm capable of yet." "I know," she said, "but I want to find out." He looked at her. "That's a more certain thing than I've been able to say about anything since—" He stopped. "That's a more certain thing." She looked at him in the lamplight, at this man who was imperfect and broken in specific, identifiable ways and honest about most of them, at this kitchen with its mismatching chairs and its stove with the temperamental damper, at the quiet house around her full of sleeping children. "Ask me to stay," she said. He held her gaze. "Stay," he said. She nodded. Once, simply. The lamp burned between them. The fire settled into its coals with a small, quiet sound. Outside, the new year had already begun, unmarked by anything more ceremonious than the turning of the dark. But somewhere in the night, without fanfare, something that had been holding its breath finally let it go. January came in hard, the way Montana Januaries do. Not a gradual cooling, but a drop, sudden and total, as if the season had been waiting just beyond the tree line and had finally decided to stop being patient about it. The temperature fell below 0 on the 3rd and stayed there for 11 days. The cattle had to be checked twice daily. The water troughs froze overnight regardless of what precautions were taken. The children were confined inside for stretches of time that tested everyone's tolerance for each other in ways that the holiday season's goodwill did not fully survive. Thomas broke a window on the 7th. Not maliciously. He'd been throwing a rubber ball against the wall in the back hallway, which he'd been told not to do 3 separate times, and on the 4th throw it came off the wall at an angle nobody had predicted and went through the small pane beside the door with a sound that brought every person in the house to the hallway within 30 seconds. Caleb stood in the hallway looking at the broken glass and the cold air coming in through the gap, and then at Thomas, who was standing with the ball in his hands and an expression that was working very hard to appear calm. "I told you," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, which was worse than loud. "I know," Thomas said. 3 times. "I know." "What are you going to do about it?" Thomas looked at the window, then at his father. "I'll fix it," he said. "I know how to replace glass. Mr. Hennessy showed me. The glass is in town. You can't get to town. I'll board it until we can get to town." Caleb looked at him for another moment and then stepped aside. "Get the boards," he said. "And when you're done, you're going to write a full page, on why you don't throw balls in the house, in complete sentences." Thomas went to get the boards. Eliza, who had been standing at the edge of the hallway through all of this, went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Benny say quietly to nobody in particular, "I told him that would happen," and Clara say equally quietly, "Benny, not right now." She'd been at the ranch 12 days. 12 days since New Year's. Since the lamplight conversation, since Caleb had said stay, and she had said yes. 12 days of waking up in the small cedar room and coming downstairs and making coffee, and falling into the work of the household as if she'd been doing it for years. And the strangeness of it had been receding, slowly, not all at once, but in increments, the way ice goes. Not visibly, but one morning you notice the edge has moved. What she was learning about Caleb Mitchell in those 12 days was that he was a man of patterns. He woke before light, every morning without exception. He came in from the barn between 6:30 and 7. He drank 2 cups of coffee before he said much of anything, And during the second cup, he was either reading something or looking out the window with a quality of attention that was not absent but internal, going over things she wasn't privy to. He was short-tempered when he was tired, and he was often tired, and the short-temperedness came out in the particular form of people who were raised to believe that showing emotion directly was self-indulgent. It came out sideways, as silence or as clipped efficiency, and she'd learned to read the difference between his working silences and his difficult ones. He was better with the children than he gave himself credit for. Not in the warm, demonstrative way the letters had described. That version of him had been Clara's invention, the father she remembered from before, but in the way of someone who paid attention, who remembered things. He knew which book Benny was on without being told. He noticed when Annie was tired versus when she was quiet for her own reasons. He knew that Thomas's relentless energy spiked worse on days when the weather kept him in and made a point, on those days, of finding something physical for him to do. What he didn't do was reach. He did not reach toward the children emotionally, and they had learned to live inside that limitation with the adaptive flexibility that children have, building their lives around the shape of what was available. Eliza watched this without comment and without judgment, because judgment wouldn't have helped anything. But she watched it. It was Clara who told her what had changed on a Wednesday afternoon when the temperature had risen just enough for the younger children to go outside, and they were alone in the kitchen with the bread dough and a quiet that felt earned. "He told us about her last night," Claire said. Eliza looked up. "About your mother?" "Yes." Clara punched the dough with the practiced compression of someone who had been making bread since she was 8. "Not about her dying, about her, about what she was like. We were at supper, and Benny asked him something about what she did before they got married, and normally he changes the subject, or he says not right now, and we stopped asking." She paused. "Last night he answered. He told us about how they met. He talked for maybe 20 minutes. Eliza set down the cloth she was using. "What did the children do?" Clara's expression did something complicated. "Nothing. Nobody moved. I think we were all afraid that if anyone made a noise, he'd stop." She was quiet for a moment. James was in his chair eating his supper, and he sat there very still looking at Pa's face. He doesn't understand the words, not most of them. But he knew something was different. Eliza picked the cloth back up. "He came and knocked on my door after," Clara said. "After the others were in bed. He sat on the edge of the chair and said—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "He said he was sorry he'd made it a closed subject. He said she deserved better than to be a name we all tiptoed around." Eliza didn't say anything. There was nothing to add to that. "He's different since you came," Clara said, not looking at her. She said it as a statement of fact, not as a gift being offered or a manipulation being deployed, just as accurate reporting, which was Clara's native language. Not completely, not in a big way, but different. "People change at their own pace," Eliza said. "I know." Clara looked at her. "I'm just telling you in case it helps you understand why we need you to stay." It was the directness of it that got to her. Not want, not hope. Need, said plainly by a 13-year-old who had learned, through necessity, to say the actual thing. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara," she said. Clara nodded once the way her father nodded, short and certain, and went back to the bread. The trouble started on the 14th of January. It arrived, as trouble in small communities often does, not with any single event, but as an accumulation. A temperature change you notice only after the damage is done. Eliza had gone to town with Caleb to get supplies and to replace the window glass, and to handle several pieces of correspondence he'd been putting off. Cedar Bend was not a large town. A main street of maybe a dozen businesses, a bank, a post office, 2 saloons, a general store, and a church. And by the time she'd been there an hour, she understood that it was the kind of small community where everyone knew about the Mitchell children and the Boston woman, and had known about it considerably longer than she might have expected. Mrs. Hartwell, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store, was friendly in the way of someone who is going to tell you something and hasn't decided yet whether to wrap it nicely. She complimented Eliza's coat and asked about Boston, and mentioned the Mitchell children in the tone of someone raising a subject they feel entitled to raise. "Clara Mitchell is a remarkable girl," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I've always thought so, though I do think it must have been very difficult for her, the situation. For all of them. Children are resilient, Eliza said, which was the answer that closed a subject rather than opening it. Mrs. Hartwell's expression adjusted slightly. And you're planning to stay then? Yes, Eliza said. She paused. Forgive me, I don't mean to pry, but in what capacity exactly? I only ask because people have been wondering, and it would be better for the children, I'd think, for there to be clarity about, in the capacity of someone who lives there, Eliza said pleasantly. I'll take 2 yards of the blue flannel as well, please. Mrs. Hartwell got the flannel without pushing further, but Eliza felt the look that followed her to the door. Outside, she found Caleb loading supplies into the wagon bed and told him what had happened, not because it frightened her, but because he should know what was being said. He listened with his hand still on the crate he'd been moving, and then set the crate down. Mrs. Hartwell's been watching that situation for 2 years, he said. She watches everything. I know the type, Eliza said. I'm not worried about Mrs. Hartwell. I'm telling you because there will be others like her, and you should know what the conversation is. He looked at her. The conversation being that a man with 5 children has an unmarried woman living in his house, and nobody's offered an explanation. That's the conversation, she said. He picked up another crate. What do you want to do about it? She watched him. I don't know yet, she said. What do you want to do about it? He put the crate in the wagon and turned to face her in the cold January street. He looked at her with the steadiness she'd come to understand was not blankness, but concentration, that particular quality of a man who is taking stock of something before he responds. I want to do what's right for you, he said, not what's right for what other people think. Those things are going to keep intersecting, she said. This is a small town. I know what kind of town it is. Then you know that how people see this affects the children too. Claire is old enough that it matters what the community thinks of her household. He was quiet. I'm not saying it drives the decision, she said. I'm saying it's a real thing. Yes, he said. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she recognized as his version of working something through. Yes, it is. They drove home in the afternoon light with the wagon full and the conversation unfinished, because some conversations don't finish in a day, and forcing them to was how you got answers that didn't hold. What happened over the following week was not a crisis so much as a pressure, slow and steady, the kind that finds the places a structure is already stressed. The community's attention settled on the Mitchell Ranch in the specific way of small communities that have decided something requires resolution. Not hostile, not openly intrusive, but present, in the form of invitations to social occasions that were also inquiries, in the form of neighborly visits that lasted longer than they needed to, in the form of questions asked of Clara in town that were designed to collect information rather than to express interest in Clara. Clara handled all of it with a composure that Eliza found both impressive and heartbreaking, because composure at 13 shouldn't have to be that practiced. Caleb became quieter, not in the difficult way Eliza had learned to read as retreat, but in the way of someone processing something privately, working through a calculation that required more concentration than he could give it while also speaking. She let him have the space for it. She'd learned that pushing him was counterproductive, that he needed to arrive at things on his own timeline, or he arrived at them without conviction, and conviction was the only version of him that held. But she was also aware, in a part of herself that she'd kept quieter than usual, that she was waiting, that she had committed to this situation, had said yes, had stayed, had built something real in the days since New Year's, and was now waiting to see if the commitment would be met in kind. That was not a comfortable awareness. She didn't dwell on it. She spent the waiting in useful work, because useful work was what she knew how to do with discomfort. She finished the accumulated mending. She made Annie 3 new skirts from the blue flannel, because Annie had been wearing the same 2 for 6 months and the hems were frayed. She taught Clara how to do the books for the household accounts in a way that would make more sense when Clara eventually handed them off to someone. When she got to be a child, Eliza thought, though she didn't say it that way. She made Thomas read aloud for an hour each evening, which he resisted and then became attached to because Thomas loved language as much as he loved everything else, and nobody had thought to give him the specifically pleasurable version of it. And she sat with James in the evenings, When the others were in bed and Caleb was doing the accounts or reading by the fire, and James pulled himself up to standing using her legs as a support structure and looked at everything around him with the concentrated seriousness of a person learning the world. And she watched him and thought about things she hadn't let herself think about in Boston, where the future had always been a practical matter rather than an emotional one. It was Benny who started it on a Thursday evening, the way Benny started most important things, sideways, appearing to be talking about something else. He came and sat across from Eliza at the kitchen table while she was mending a torn seam on Caleb's work coat, and he had the book in his hands, but he wasn't reading it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. "I may not answer." "Fair." He turned the book over in his hands. "Do you love him?" She looked up. Benny met her eyes with the steady directness that was particular to him. Not aggressive, not performing, just genuinely wanting to know. He was 11 years old, and he had the quality of someone who had learned to ask the actual question because he'd seen what happened when you didn't. "That's a large question," she said. "I know. That's why I'm asking it instead of a smaller one." She set the coat down. "I think that what I feel for your father is real," she said carefully, "and I think it's becoming something, but love is a word that means something specific, and I don't want to use it before I'm sure I mean it exactly." Benny considered this. "That's a more careful answer than I expected." "I'm a careful person." "He loves you," Benny said. "Not meanly, not as leverage, just as information. I think he's scared of it. I think he doesn't know what to do with it because the last time he loved someone, she died, and that broke something in him. And he's worried if he does it again, the same thing will—" He stopped. "I know that's not a rational worry. I'm just telling you what I think he's thinking." "You think a lot," Eliza said. "I know," he said. "Thomas says it's annoying." "Thomas is not always wrong." Benny almost smiled. "Will you stay?" he said. "Whatever happens with him, whatever he decides or doesn't decide, will you stay?" She looked at him for a moment. This boy with his book and his careful eyes and his specific kind of quiet intelligence. "I want to," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have right now." He nodded, as if that was enough. "Okay," he said, and opened his book, and she picked up the coat, and they sat in companionable silence while the fire went on burning. Caleb found her in the sewing room on a Saturday afternoon when the children were scattered around the house in their various occupations, and the ranch had achieved one of its rare states of temporary equilibrium. He stood in the doorway without speaking, and she looked up from the seam she was working and waited. He came in, sat on the low stool, the one Clara always took when she came in to talk, and she noted the coincidence of that without commenting on it. He leaned his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up. "Am I that obvious?" "When you're thinking about something specific, you get very quiet, and you start checking the fence line even when it doesn't need checking," she said. "You've checked it 4 times this week." Something moved across his face. "The fence is fine," he said. "I know the fence is fine." He exhaled, looked at his hands again. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that it's not about what people in town think, and it's not about the children, and it's not about practicality or what makes sense. It's about—" He stopped, tried again. "I've spent 2 years making decisions that were about protecting something, the ranch, the children, the idea of what we were, and I think some of those decisions were right, and some of them were just fear with a practical excuse." She held the coat still in her hands and listened. "I think you're the bravest person I've met in a long time," he said, "not because of what you did coming here, though that took something most people don't have, because of how you've been since, because you stayed in a hard situation without making it easier than it is, and because you've been honest with me when honesty was uncomfortable, and because you—" He paused. "You love my children. I can see it. And they love you. And I'm sitting here telling myself it's too fast, it's too soon. I don't know you well enough yet. All the things that are true and also are excuses." "They are true," she said, "and they are also excuses." "I know." He looked at her. "I want to stop making excuses." The house was quiet around them. She could hear Benny reading to James somewhere down the hall, his voice rising and falling in the specific rhythm he used when he was doing character voices, which meant James was probably doing his concentrated listening face, the one that looked like a small judge weighing evidence. "What are you asking me, Caleb?" she said quietly. He straightened, put his hands flat on his knees, looked at her with the directness that cost him something every time. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to stay permanently," he said, "as my wife. If you'd be willing to marry me." He paused. "Not because the town needs an explanation, and not because the children need a mother, though both things are true. Because I want you here. Because I wake up now, and the first thing I think about is whether you're already downstairs. And when you are, I am." He stopped. "I feel something in the morning that I haven't felt in 2 years, and I think it would be dishonest to know that and not say so." Eliza looked at him. Caleb Mitchell was not a romantic man. He had not made her a romantic proposal. No performance, no practiced words, nothing that could be called a gesture. What he had made her was an honest one, and she had told him at the beginning that she preferred honest to comfortable, and she had meant it. She should have said yes immediately. The yes was there, she could feel it, straightforward and clear, but... "Caleb," she said, "I need to ask you something first." He waited. "The letter you started," she said. "The real one, from February. The one in the drawer. Did you ever finish it?" He blinked. "No." "What did it say? What you'd written?" He was quiet for a moment. She saw him going back to it, retrieving it. It said, "I wrote about the ranch, about the children, about what I was looking for and what I couldn't offer. I was trying to be fair about it." "And what couldn't you offer?" He held her gaze. "At the time? Myself. Not fully. I knew that then. I wrote it down because I thought it was important to be clear. And now?" she said. He didn't look away. "Now I think I'm more willing to try than I've been since before she died. That's not a guarantee. I can't promise you I'll do it without flinching, but I'm willing to try." She thought about Benny's question 3 evenings ago, sitting across the kitchen table. "Do you love him?" And her careful answer about real things becoming something. She thought about the hill in the cold, his hand open in the space between them. She thought about 12 years of a careful life in Boston and what she'd been trying to get away from when she'd packed those 2 bags and gotten on the train. "Yes," she said. He went still for a moment as if the word needed a second to be real. "Yes," she said again, more plainly. "I'll marry you." He exhaled. Not dramatically, not visibly moved in the way that stories expected, but something went out of him, some held thing, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and put his face briefly in his hands, and she understood that as the particular privacy of a man who has been braced for a long time against something and is now allowed, just for a moment, to not be. She set the coat down and reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he raised his head and looked at her with red at the edges of his eyes that he was not going to acknowledge, and that she was not going to point out. "All right," he said, in a rough voice. "All right," she agreed. "Bob," Clara figured it out before anyone told her. She came in from the yard that afternoon and looked at both of them across the kitchen, and something passed through her face in rapid sequence. Relief, then something softer, then the specific expression of someone who has been managing a plan for a long time and has just learned that it is going to work, and is not sure how to hold that yet. She didn't say anything about it. She took off her coat, hung it up, and went to check on the bread. After a moment, she said, "The bread's going to need another 20 minutes. "That's fine," Eliza said. "We're not in a hurry." Clara stood with her back to them, hands braced on the counter. Her shoulders rose and fell once. "Good," she said, to the bread. Thomas was told at supper and responded with the energetic approval of someone who had decided this was good news and was going to make sure everyone in the vicinity knew he'd also decided it was his idea. Annie, who had known something was coming in the way she always knew things before they were announced, simply smiled, the smile that made her look exactly like the photograph on the mantel, and then put her head down over her plate as if she didn't want anyone to see it. Benny looked at Eliza across the table and nodded once, The way she'd come to understand was his particular form of satisfaction. James ate his supper and knocked his spoon off his tray 3 times, and each time Eliza retrieved it for him without comment. And the third time he looked at her with the solemn, knowing expression of someone who has confirmed something important to his own theory of how things work. That night, after the children were in bed, Caleb and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the way they had on New Year's Eve, the night he'd first asked her to stay. Outside, the January cold pressed against the windows, and the house held its warmth against it with the stubborn practicality of a structure that had been built to last. "I should write to the Reverend in town," he said, "about the ceremony." "There's no rush," she said. "I know." He looked at the lamp. I want it to be done. Not because I doubt anything. I want to stop standing in the doorway of it." She understood that. Completely. The doorway was the hardest place, that threshold where you could still technically turn around. She'd been standing in doorways for most of her adult life. "Write the letter," she said. He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I've been sure," she said. "I was just waiting for you to be." He almost smiled. The real one, the rare one that she'd seen only a handful of times, and that changed his whole face. She had decided, in the quiet of her own mind, that she was going to spend a considerable portion of whatever came next trying to produce that expression more frequently. Not because it was her responsibility, but because it seemed like an interesting project, the kind that wouldn't be finished quickly and would keep surprising her. Outside, the snow had started again, soft, steady, the kind that didn't announce itself but simply accumulated, covering the fence line and the porch steps and the long road back to Cedar Bend, making the world smaller and the house at the center of it feel, for the first time in a long time, like the specific kind of shelter that has nothing to do with walls and everything to do with who's inside them. The letter to the Reverend was written on a Sunday and sent to town with the supply run on Monday, and by Wednesday the news had traveled through Cedar Bend in the efficient and slightly breathless way that news travels in small towns where not enough happens and people have learned to make the most of what does. Mrs. Hartwell sent a jar of preserves. The Hendersons sent a note of congratulation that was warm and genuine and arrived the same afternoon as a considerably cooler note from a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who Caleb described only as a person with opinions, and whose note contained 3 sentences of good wishes and 1 sentence of pointed inquiry about the timeline of the arrangement that Eliza read once and then used to level a wobbly table leg. Caleb saw her do it and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. "Is that the appropriate response to Mrs. Pruitt's correspondence?" he asked. "It's the most useful one," Eliza said. He accepted this. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of February, which gave them 5 weeks, enough time to manage the practical requirements without so much time that the waiting became its own kind of pressure. Eliza wrote to her former landlady in Boston to settle the last of her affairs there, a letter that took 3 drafts because she kept having to decide how much to explain and eventually concluded that the truth was simpler than any careful version of it. She had found something worth staying for. She sent it on a Tuesday and felt, when she came back inside from the postwriter, the specific lightness of a person who has closed a door that needed closing. She did not feel sad about Boston. That surprised her a little. She had lived there for 12 years and had not expected the leaving to be so clean. But Boston had been a place she'd inhabited rather than belonged to, and there was a difference, and she'd always known it even when she'd been too practical to admit it. The 5 weeks were not uncomplicated. Nothing about the Mitchell Ranch was uncomplicated, which Eliza had understood since approximately the first hour of her arrival and had decided was not a deterrent. Caleb had a bad week in early February. One of the heifers died, a loss he absorbed with the closed-off efficiency of a man who had learned to process grief in private, and it triggered something darker than just the practical setback. She watched him go quiet in the difficult way, the retreat she'd learned to recognize, and she didn't chase him into it. She was there, consistently, and she did not require him to be other than he was. And on the 4th night he came in from the barn later than usual and sat at the kitchen table and said, "I'm sorry I've been hard company." And she said, "You haven't been hard company. You've been sad." And something in his face shifted. "Same thing," he said. "It's not." she said. He looked at her. How is it different? Hard company makes things worse, she said. Sad is just sad. It doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be sat with. He was quiet for a moment. You're good at that, he said. Sitting with things. I've had practice, she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and they sat there in the kitchen while the fire burned down, and she thought about what she'd told Benny. That love was a word she wanted to use precisely. She thought she was ready to use it precisely now, though she didn't say it that night because the moment wasn't about words. Some moments don't need them. Clara turned 14 in the first week of February, and Eliza made her a dress, not the household flannel, not practical cotton, but a proper dress from a deep green wool she'd ordered from the general store, and which had arrived looking better than she'd hoped. She cut it and fitted it over 3 evenings while Clara sat in the sewing room doing her reading and pretending not to notice what was happening. And when it was finished, she put it on the girl and stood back and saw Clara Mitchell look at herself in the mirror with an expression she clearly hadn't been expecting. It fit her correctly. Not like a child's dress, and not like something borrowed from a woman's wardrobe. Like something made for the person she was right now, 14 years old, still becoming, already more than most people twice her age. Oh, Clara said to her own reflection. Eliza straightened the collar and didn't say anything. Clara stopped. You look like yourself, Eliza said, the version of yourself that isn't running the household. Clara's jaw moved. She was not going to cry. Eliza could see that. Clara Mitchell did not cry in front of people, a habit learned young and held on too hard. But something was happening in her face that was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who has been seen accurately and does not quite know how to receive it. Thank you, Clara said, after a moment, in a voice that was carefully even. Happy birthday, Eliza said. Clara wore the dress to supper that evening, and Thomas said it looked very green, and Benny said it looked nice, and Caleb looked at his daughter across the table with an expression Eliza caught only in profile, something opening in it, some recognition of the girl Clara was, rather than the small adult she'd made herself into. And he said simply, You look beautiful, Clara. And Clara sat very straight in her chair and said, Thank you, Pa, and ate her supper with her chin up. It was a small thing. The small things were what made up a life. The wedding was on a Saturday, as planned, in the parlor of the Mitchell house because the Reverend was willing to come out to them, and the weather in late February was not the kind to ask children to stand still in for the duration of a ceremony in an unheated church. Eliza wore the best dress she'd brought from Boston, dark blue, which she had altered slightly in the week before because the waist had needed taking in. Working a ranch, it turned out, was more physically demanding than sitting at a sewing table, and she had put Annie's tin star in the buttonhole of Caleb's best jacket, which made Thomas intensely proud and which Caleb accepted with the grace of a man who has learned that some things are not worth arguing about and are in fact worth more than they appear. There were no guests except the Hendersons, who were the closest thing the Mitchells had to family outside of blood, and Mrs. Henderson cried from the first word of the ceremony and did not stop until well after it was finished, which she apologized for and which nobody minded. The Reverend was a practical man who kept the words short and the meaning clear. Caleb said his vows in the deliberate voice he used when something mattered, and Eliza said hers with the same steadiness she'd brought to everything since Cedar Bend, not performing certainty but possessing it, which was different. James, who was being held by Benny and had been bribed with a piece of dried apple to remain quiet, lasted through almost the entire ceremony before deciding he'd been patient long enough and reaching both arms toward Eliza with the expectant authority of a person who does not see why the current situation requires him to be separated from the person he wants to be near. Benny handed him over without being asked. Eliza took him with one arm and finished the last of her vows with James on her hip, which was not how she'd imagined it and was exactly right. Caleb looked at her, at the two of them, and something in his face went so unguarded for just a moment that she thought she saw all the way through to the man he'd been before, and the man he was now, and the long, difficult distance between the two, and what it had cost him to cross it. She held his gaze and let him see the same in hers. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Thomas immediately cheered, which caused everyone to laugh. And the ceremony ended the way the best things end. Not in ceremony, but in the sudden warmth of people who are glad to be in the same room. Sakik. What nobody tells you about choosing a life is that the choosing doesn't happen once. It happens every day, in small decisions that don't feel like decisions, in the accumulation of ordinary moments that turn out to be the substance of everything. Eliza learned this in the months after the wedding, not as a grand revelation, but as a slow understanding that came through living it. She woke each morning in a room that was not the cedar room at the end of the hall, but the room she shared with Caleb, which was larger and had a window that faced east and caught the first light. And she lay there in the early quiet before the house came alive and understood that this was the life she had chosen and was choosing again, today, in the specific and unglamorous form it took this morning. Some mornings that was easy. Some mornings it was hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. She and Caleb did not have a seamless marriage. Nobody who is honest about it has a seamless marriage, and Eliza was constitutionally honest. He was difficult when he was tired and often tired. She was impatient with indirection, which sometimes read as coldness when it was not coldness but frustration, and she had to learn to say that out loud rather than letting it sit in the room between them as a thing he tried to decipher. They argued, twice, seriously, once about money, once about Thomas, both times about things that were really about something underneath the thing they were arguing about, and both times they came through it with more understanding of each other than they'd had going in, which she took as evidence not that the arguments were good, but that the people having them were. He learned to say what he was feeling before it became a wall. She learned to let him take longer than she wanted to get there. These were not small adjustments. They were the work of it, the daily work, the thing that didn't look like love from the outside but was, from the inside, what love actually consisted of. Spring came late that year, the way it does in Montana, where the calendar says one thing and the weather says it'll get there when it gets there. But it came. The snow went off the south-facing slopes first, then the valley, then the creek ran free in a rush of snowmelt that Thomas monitored with daily reports, and the cattle moved to the upper pasture, and the quality of the light changed. Longer, warmer, the particular gold of late afternoon that made even the battered fence line look like something worth painting. Annie painted it. She had filled 2 sketchbooks by May, and Eliza had ordered her a third, the same good kind with the thick paper, and Annie had looked at it and said, "You didn't have to," in the tone of someone who means thank you and hasn't quite learned yet that it's all right to say so directly. "I know I didn't have to," Eliza said. "That's not why I did it." Annie turned the sketchbook over in her hands. "Why did you?" "Because you're very good," Eliza said, "and because good things should be given the materials they need." Annie looked at her for a moment with those careful, seeing eyes. "Mama used to say something like that," she said. "Not exactly that, but something like it." Eliza didn't say anything. "I think she would have liked you," Annie said. Not performing, not offering comfort, just reporting the way Annie always reported, with the flat accuracy of someone describing what she actually believed. She didn't like people who were pretending to be something. She always knew. "That sounds like a difficult quality to be around sometimes," Eliza said. "It was," Annie said, with a small, real smile. "She always knew when I was pretending I'd done my reading." Eliza laughed. Actual, unguarded laughter, the kind she hadn't done much of in Boston, where being laughed at had always felt more likely than laughing. Annie looked pleased with herself in the quiet way that was her specific version of delight. That evening, Eliza told Caleb what Annie had said, lying in the east-facing room with the late spring dark outside the window, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "She would have. She didn't have patience for performance. It drove her crazy at church." He talked about Margaret more freely now, not constantly, not in a way that filled every room, but naturally, the way you talk about someone who is real and is gone and whose goneness is a fact you've learned to live alongside rather than a wound you're still trying to keep closed. Eliza understood, through months of listening, that this was what healing actually looked like. Not the erasure of grief, but its integration, the way an old injury eventually stops being the thing you notice about your leg and becomes just the leg, present, functional, occasionally aching in cold weather. She did not feel jealous of Margaret. She had thought she might, early on, had braced for it. But what she felt instead was something closer to respect, for a woman she would never meet but whose children she was helping to raise, whose house she was learning to fill differently but not less, whose husband had loved her well and badly in the specific human mixture that most love contains. She thought sometimes that the letters had not been entirely a lie. The man Clara had tried to conjure through borrowed handwriting, the man who was good with words, who noticed things, who wanted to build something alongside another person, he had existed. He had existed before, and he had been buried. And the children had reached through a stranger to try to dig him out. They had been wrong to do it the way they did it. They had also not been wrong about him. Well, Thomas did not burn anything down, which Benny considered his single greatest accomplishment of the spring, and said so, at length, at a supper table in April. Thomas took this with moderate dignity. "I've matured," he said. "You broke a fence post last Tuesday," Benny said. "That was structural failure. The post was already compromised." "You hit it with a shovel." "I was testing its structural integrity." Caleb did not look up from his plate. "The fence post," he said, "will come out of your earnings from the spring work." Thomas absorbed this. "That's fair," he said, which surprised everyone slightly, including Thomas, who seemed surprised by it himself. He was growing up. They all were, in the ways specific to each of them. Benny would finish his schooling in 2 more years and had begun, quietly, to talk about what came after. Not leaving the ranch, but expanding it in his mind, thinking about land management and water rights, and the mathematics of what was possible. Eliza listened to these conversations with genuine interest and said, more than once, that he was the person in this family who was going to be rich someday, which embarrassed him and which she meant as a straightforward prediction. Clara, in the spring of her 14th year, did something that Eliza had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. She came downstairs one Saturday morning and said, in the casual tone of someone mentioning something that is not casual at all, "I've been corresponding with the Henderson girls. They're putting together a literary society. They want to know if I'd come." The Henderson girls were 15 and 17. The literary society met twice a month in town. "Yes," Eliza said immediately, before anyone else could say anything. Clara looked at her. "Pa hasn't—" "He will," Eliza said, and looked across the table at Caleb. Caleb set down his coffee. He looked at his daughter, this girl who had been running his house since she was 11, who had forged his handwriting out of desperation, who had stood on a frozen platform and told the truth to a stranger with her chin up. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "of course." Clara went back to her breakfast. She did not make a production of it, but something about the way she held her shoulders changed slightly, some tension that had been there so long it had become structural going out of them, and Eliza thought, There it is. That's what we were working toward. Not the literary society specifically, the possibility of the literary society. The idea that Clara Mitchell's life had room in it now for something that was just hers, not the household's, not her siblings, not her griefs, just hers. James took his first real steps in March, lurching across the kitchen floor with the magnificent overconfidence of someone who has decided that falling is an acceptable cost of forward motion. He made it 4 steps before sitting down hard on the floorboards, looked at the floor with an expression of mild betrayal, and then looked up at Eliza, who was crouched in front of him with her hands out. "Again," she said. He got up, made it 5 steps this time. Caleb watched from the doorway, arms crossed, with the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't been sure he'd get to have. He didn't say anything. He just watched James walk across the kitchen to Eliza and watched her catch him, and the room held something so full it was almost too much to be in. Later, after James was asleep and the house was quiet, Caleb said to her, "Thank you." And she said, "For what?" And he said, "For being here for that." And she understood he meant something larger than the walking, and she said, "I was always going to be here for that." And he said, "I know." And the simplicity of those 3 words contained something she'd been waiting for him to mean for a long time. There is a particular lie that stories tell about love found in difficult circumstances, which is that the difficulty is what makes it meaningful, that the hardship was worth it because it led here, to this good thing. Eliza thought about this sometimes, in the quiet moments of the life she'd built, and she rejected it. The difficulty was not what made it meaningful. It was just the difficulty. It had been real, and it had been hard, and some of it had been unnecessary, and if she could have arrived here without it, she would have. What she believed instead was something simpler and less romantic and more true. That meaning is not found at the end of things. It accumulates. It is made, slowly, out of ordinary material, by people who choose each other on days when the choosing is easy and on days when it is not, and who show up the next morning and make coffee and check on the heifer and help a child with mathematics she resents, and sit in a room that is cold in the corners and call it home because home is not a feeling that arrives. It is a practice. She had practiced it, imperfectly, for months now. She was going to keep practicing it. On a Sunday evening in May, with the windows open for the first time and the smell of the thaw coming in with the evening air, the six of them sat at the dinner table with all six chairs filled the way they were every night now, the way she'd stopped noticing as remarkable because it had become simply true, and Thomas was in the middle of a detailed account of a naming dispute he was having with Benny over a new calf, and Benny was refuting each point with precise and infuriating calm, and Clara was listening with the half-smile she'd been wearing more frequently since the literary society had started, and Annie was drawing something small on the edge of her napkin, and James was eating enthusiastically with both hands with no reference to the spoon that had been provided for him. Caleb caught Eliza's eye across the table. He had the expression she'd been trying to produce more frequently, the rare, real one that changed his whole face. She held it for a moment, looked around the table at the noise and the mess and the imperfect, ordinary life of it. She thought about Cedar Bend Station, the empty platform, the cold, the letter in her pocket with its soft, worn creases, the sleigh that had come around the corner of the depot with its bells and its gray horses and its cargo of 5 desperate children. The girl who had climbed down and said, "I had to try," in that flat, certain voice. She thought about what she'd told Annie, months ago, in the small sewing room with the good paper and the growing sketchbooks. Real things deserve the materials they need. This was real, all of it. The noise and the dense bread and the broken window glass and the difficult silences and the morning coffee and the east-facing light and the man across the table with the rare expression and the 5 children between them who had built this out of a lie because they needed it badly enough to reach for it. It was real, and it was hers. And she had not arrived at it by accident or by luck or by the smooth working of a plan. She had arrived at it by getting in the sleigh. That was the thing she would have told herself if she could have told the woman standing on the platform anything: get in the sleigh. Not because it will be what you expect, not because it will be easy, but because the life you've been living carefully, the life with all the exits marked, is not a life. It's a waiting room, and there is no scheduled arrival, and eventually you have to decide that wherever you are right now is the place you're going to start from. She had started. Every day she started again. Thomas resolved his argument with Benny by appealing to Caleb as arbiter, who ruled in Benny's favor without hearing more than one sentence of the case, which Thomas protested as procedurally unjust and which made Clara laugh. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that turns a face young again. James looked at his sister laughing and decided it was a good development and laughed too, for no reason except that laughing seemed to be happening and he was in favor of it. Annie put down her napkin and held up the small drawing she'd been working on. It was the table from above somehow, the way a bird might see it. 6 people around it, the lamp at the center, the suggestion of food and cups and the clutter of a real meal in progress, and every face turned slightly toward the center, toward the light, the way people turn toward warmth without deciding to. "That's us," Thomas said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Yes," Annie said. Caleb took it from her and looked at it for a moment. Then he passed it to Eliza. She held it in both hands. The 6 of them, imperfect and noisy and real, gathered around a table in Montana in the spring, with the windows open and the evening air coming in a house that had been haunted by loss and was choosing, one ordinary day at a time, to be something else. She set it down in front of her where she could see it. "After supper," she said, "I'm going to frame this." Annie looked up at her with those careful, seeing eyes. "You don't have to." "I know," Eliza said. "That's not why I'm doing it." Outside, the evening settled over the valley, over the fence line and the frozen, no longer creek, and the mountains that were always there regardless of the season. enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the specific way of things that have been here long before you and will be here long after, and do not require anything from you except that you look at them honestly. Inside, the lamp burned. The 6 chairs were filled. The woman who had arrived on a false promise had built something truer than the promise had been. Not because of the children's plan, not because of Clara's forged letters, not because of what she'd expected to find, but because she had gotten in the sleigh and stayed through the cold, and chosen the people who had already, without quite meaning to, chosen her. Home, she had learned, is not the place you come from. It is not even the place you arrive at. It is the place you keep choosing every morning when you come downstairs and make the coffee, and the house is cold in the corners, and the day has not yet decided what it will be. She chose it. Every day, she chose it. And that was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.